So once again, good evening to everybody for joining us in tonight's session. It's my great honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Stephanie Martinak. Stephanie completed her BA and Masters at the University of the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. And for her BA, she studied in the Anubis shrine from the tomb of Tutankhamun, while for her Masters, she studied the motif of Anubis at the Bier in Theban private tombs of the New Kingdom. The latter which she's adapted into her current PhD research, in which she examines the motif of Anubis at the Bier and its iconic details more closely in a diachronic context from the New Kingdom to the Greco-Roman period. And we're very happy that Stephanie is able to join us tonight in order to present her research, including a number of objects from the Egypt Center collection, which she contacted us about just several months ago and was due to present at our conference several weeks ago. So it's really great that she has been able to join us tonight via Zoom. And over to you.
Well, thank you, Ken, for the introduction and also for inviting me to be part of this wonderful series of Zoom lectures. And also thank you to everybody who joins me tonight as I talk about a bit of my current PhD research. As Anubis at the Bier is a very interesting motif because it is probably one of the most well-known ancient Egyptian funerary motifs that has never been properly studied. So I am okay. Now it works. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this particular motif. That is probably the most famous amongst the Anubis at the Bier motifs. This is from the tomb of Sennacherib, from the craftsman village of Deir al-Medina, and it is very often used when talking or when dealing with the topic of embalming in ancient Egypt, as the common assumption of this motif is that we have either the god Anubis himself or a priest wearing an Anubis mask being in the process of embalming the deceased. And that is a very interesting idea, as a lot of times people suggest we cannot decide whether it is Anubis or a priest wearing a mask. The idea with the masked priest is then often supported by this piece, the Anubis mask, that is now in the Römer and Pelizaeus Museum in Hildesheim. And it is made out of clay and is weighing about 8 kilograms. So that is probably clearly too heavy to wear, especially over a longer period of time. Therefore, it has been suggested that this mask is a model, and the ancient Egyptians used to make masks like this out of lighter material, such as cartonnage, although the only cartonnage mask that we have found, or fragments of it, are now in the Harrogate Museum. So I think it's always a bit questionable to assume a mask like that would have been worn by a priest during the actual embalming process. Especially as if we look at the motif during the New Kingdom, and that will be the first part of my lecture, we see that there is a lot more to the Anubis at the Bier motif than we usually think. But before I jump right into the motif, I first wanted to talk a bit about the motif's origins. The Anubis at the Bier motif first appears in the 18th dynasty, and the earliest examples I have found all date to the reign of Amenhotep II, so I assume that could be where this motif, as a motif, first appears, as the idea of Anubis being the one who tends the mummy of the king is as old as the New Kingdom. It first appears in the pyramid texts. Now what we see in this is the complete Book of the Dead Vignette to spell 151 Book of the Dead, and the centerpiece is Anubis at the Bier, flanked usually by Isis at the feet of the deceased and Nephthys at the head. This is surrounded by the walls of probably the burial chamber, and on each of the four walls we then have a niche holding one of the four magic bricks that were there to protect the deceased. The motif then quickly migrates from the Book of the Dead papyri onto the tomb walls, although the only complete Book of the Dead vignette that we have in a tomb appears in the tomb of Senefer. As usually when appearing in the tomb, we just have the middle part, the centerpiece, so to speak, with Anubis at the Bier. And before I jump right into the motif and its variations throughout the New Kingdom, I quickly wanted to show you how many appearances of the New Kingdom we have. So I so far have found a total of 42 motif appearances that can be divided into two groups. So the first group are 15 objects, and within these 15 objects, the biggest group are the 10 Book of the Dead papyri that I've found so far. By far the way larger group are 27 tombs, and 15 times the motif does appear in tombs of Deir al-Medina. It appears 3 times in Sheikh Abdel Qurna, and surprisingly 3 times in royal tombs. And that is surprising because the king usually had other books that would help him through the underworld, so he would not rely on the Book of the Dead and in its vignettes. It is also interesting that I have found 2 motif appearances in the tomb of Maya, the treasurer of Tutankhamun. As I said before, the motif seems to first appear under Amenhotep II and then continues until Amarna and the reign of Akhenaten. And there I have a break, so I have no motifs during the reign of Akhenaten, although if anybody has a motif that dates in the Amarna period, please feel free to let me know, as I would be really interested in that. So we have a break with Amarna, and then right after Amarna, the motif appears again in the tomb of Maya. And that shows us that the highest concentration of the motif throughout the New Kingdom is in Deir al-Medina. And I think that is important, as I believe the key in our understanding of the motif lies within the tombs of Deir al-Medina, as there we have the most additional elements to the basic motif that help us to understand what is going on. So, as the basic motif, I defined Anubis at the bier with the mummy of the deceased on it, and the bier itself. And everything else that we can have in the scenes is an additional element that helps with interpreting and understanding the motif. So as for a first example, I have here one of the 2 big shrines that were found in the tomb of Senedjem. So one belonged to Senedjem and one belonged to his son Khonsu. That is the one, or part of the one that we see here. And both had the Anubis at the Bier motif. And again, we have the basic motifs, Anubis with the mummy and the bier in the center. And then we have that, what I call additional elements. So we have a couple of vessels underneath. Then we have, again, Isis at the feet and Nephthys at the head. And then we have this. That is I like to call it a shrine-like structure with a vultured roof. We could also say it's a canopy, and I believe it could be a form of the signature, the divine booth that is connected to Anubis, as we do have another example of such a architectural element that can be found in the tombs of Deir al-Medina. So we have in this example again Anubis at the bier, then we have the bier itself, and here we have a first variation. So usually we would expect that the bier has a head and a tail, and this time it's lacking head and tail. Then we have a couple of different objects underneath the bier that I will discuss in a minute, and we have this. This is quite interesting, as so far I have just found it in the tombs of Deir al-Medina and in one papyri that is now in the Museum of Cairo, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and also dates to the reign of Amenhotep II. And the shape of it always reminds me of, now you cannot really see that, can you? Can I move the screen a bit? It always reminds me of the hieroglyph for signature, the divine booth. And Anubis is the foremost of the divine booth. So I suggested in my master's thesis that we might have a form of the divine booth here, of the signature. Although I have no text, no inscription that tells me what it is. And if we now look what happens in the scene itself, we can see Anubis is holding an opening of the mouth instrument. And this is quite unusual, as I do not have it in the papyri. I just have it in the tombs of Deir al-Medina and in one small wooden shrine that is now in the Louvre in Paris and is said to belong to the Queen Nefertari. So I suggest that he is performing an opening of the mouth ritual, and therefore helping the deceased to regain his eternal life. And if we look at Nephthys, and she's pouring out an Ankh-shaped vessel. An Ankh being the Egyptian hieroglyph for life, suggesting that she's pouring out water and therefore symbolically giving the deceased life, while her sister Isis is pouring out a vessel that I identified as oil vessel. So she's pouring out oil that can be connected with resurrection. So she's giving the deceased resurrection here. And if we now look at the different objects underneath the bier, we have from left to right the canopic box and the Shabti box. And I think they can both be connected to the aspect of the completed mummification, as those two objects appear in this form in the tomb when the mummification is completed. Then we have a mirror that, especially in this scenes with Anubis, can be connected to the aspect of life and therefore the aspect of resurrection. And same goes for the oil vessels, as I just mentioned. So that means that one way or the other, all these objects, not only in this particular tomb, but also in other tombs in Deir al-Medina, can be connected to the aspect of resurrection. And if we now look at the other elements that we can have in the Anubis at the bier motif, then we have the mummy. And I think what we do have in all those scenes is a complete mummy, suggesting that the mummification process is completed. So this is not a process, an ongoing process as we often think, but it is a process that has been completed. As I do believe that the deceased needs a complete mummy in order to regain his eternal life and in order to be resurrected. And then we do have Anubis. And Anubis, of course, connects to the mummy, and the mummy connects to Anubis, as he is the one who he is the god of embalming, of course, and he is the one who made the mummy. And therefore, this connects both of them to the Osirian myth, as well as the deceased, or the mummy of the deceased, can be seen as Osiris, who has been turned into a mummy by Anubis, as we are told in the Osirian myth. But I also believe that Anubis is connected to the aspect of resurrection, especially when he is seen holding the opening of the mouth instrument, as he is in those scenes taking an active part in bringing the deceased back to life. Then we have the bier itself, that can be connected to resurrection, so the aspect of resurrection, as well as Isis and Nephthys, who can also, of course, be connected to the Osirian myth. We then do have a third aspect, and I think that's the aspect of the protection of the deceased. So Anubis, the bier, as well as Isis and Nephthys are there in these scenes to protect the deceased in eternity, in his tomb. And with that, I would like to look at some general variations of the Anubis motif that can be found not only in the tombs of Deir el-Medina, but sometimes also in the papyri. And I wanted to start with the position of Anubis' hands, as we have, for the New Kingdom, 7 different positions that can be divided into 3 groups. So the first group, from left to right, is the position of the hands on top of the mummy. So Anubis can have his hands either behind each other or parallel each other on the chest of the mummy, or he has one hand placed on the chest of the mummy, while the other hand is pointing with the fingertips towards the phallic region of the mummy, therefore suggesting that he is not only protecting the mummy, but also protecting its fertility. The second group are the hands that are seemingly inside the mummy, although I do not believe that Anubis is really shown with his hands inside the mummy. But until this day, I do not know what to do with that position. Maybe it is a variation of the first group, but I'm not sure of it yet. So I still have to work on that. And the last group is the one that you already know, that is Anubis with the opening of the mouth instrument, suggesting he is performing an opening of the mouth ritual. And then we have some variations in the bier of or in those scenes. And the first variation that you have already seen is the one where the bier has head and tail. We also have one incidence where we just have a head and the tail is lacking, although due to the fact that I just have found it one time, it could also be that this was due to spatial issues. Then we have the type with tail and a lacking head, and the fourth type is the bier that is lacking both head and tail. And all these 3, except for the second type, all other 3 types, can also be found in the Book of the Dead papyri throughout the New Kingdom. And the last variation that I already explained are the 2 different architectural elements. So we have the shrine-like structure with the vultured roof, and this, I like to call it a rush mat structure with a gabled roof. And for both, I would suggest it could be that they are both representing the signature. And with that, I would like to come to the 5 objects from the Egypt Center collection and use these objects to exemplify what happens to the Anubis at the Bier motif in terms of variation after the New Kingdom. So the first object I have is this funerary stela W1041 that has a painted front as well as a painted back. So in the front we see at the top the Behedity, the representation of the Horus of Edfu, with the jet pillar underneath and the 2 lying Anubis jackals. Then we have our Anubis at the Bier motif, followed by an offering formula. And then again, the jet pillar, this time with an Osiris connected to it, and again, the 2 jackals. And on the back, we have again the Behedity, and then we have the Osiris accompanied by Isis on the right and Nephthys on the left. And underneath that, again, we have the jet pillar and 2 times the girdle of Isis. And then the Egypt Center has those 4 cartonnage body pieces. So we can have either a full body cartonnage or cartonnages that are divided into 3 to 4 pieces. And these pieces would be placed on the legs of the mummy. I want to start with the stela. That is the stela of Parsheri and Imhotep, who was an army scribe and also overseer of the priests at the temple of Horus at Edfu. The interesting thing to me is that the stela is made of wood, as usually I found just examples that are made of limestone. And when we look at the Anubis motif a bit closer, we see that first of all we have no architectural element anymore. This is something that disappears pretty quickly after the end of the New Kingdom. And then we have Anubis himself, who is holding a vessel. That is something that I wanted to research a bit deeper, and then the lockdown happened and the libraries were closed, so I couldn't do that. So for now I can just notice that somewhere around the late period, this is something that happens, that appears often when dealing with the Anubis at the Bier motif. And I still have to figure out what that is. What is also interesting about the stela in particular is that we have Isis, who is grabbing onto the Bier's tail. That is something that is so far unique. I haven't had that in any other example. And also the lion couch. From the late period to the Roman period is now always shown with head and tail. So we lose all the variations that I've just shown you for the New Kingdom. And if we now look at the different cartonnage pieces we have, then we have this. That is quite interesting, as I think something weird happened here with the Anubis, because to me it looks like he was started as to appear in front of the Bier, and for some reason the Bier was then painted over him. And that is the reason why that looks so weird here, and also might be the reason for his right hand seemingly going straight through the chest of the mummy, although I do not believe that is what was intended here, as usually his hand is placed on the chest and is not going through the chest. The second cartonnage is W877, and that is also quite interesting, as we again have the vessel, but we also do have this. Usually when Anubis is putting his hand on the mummy, his hand lies on the mummy and his palm is facing downwards. In this case, it is facing upwards, and this is something I haven't seen in any other parallel so far as well, which makes this piece also quite unique. Then we have this cartonnage that is interesting, as usually the Anubis motif appears at the top of this particular cartonnage piece, whereas here it appears in the middle. And when we look at it in detail, I have to admit that is a piece that gives me a bit of a headache, because I don't know yet really what to do with it. First of all, we have again Anubis holding a vessel, and that is something we have now seen. But in this case, he's holding another vessel, and this is something that I have so far not seen, that he's holding two vessels. We sometimes can have the case that he is holding a vessel and a piece of mummy wrapping in one hand, but usually not in both hands. But what we have, especially when we come near the end of the Ptolemaic period and then going into the Roman period, is this mummy that seems to float in the air over the bier, where, although it is actually supposed to firmly lie on the bier. And then we have here Nephthys, and I suppose that is Isis, although she is wearing the sun disk on her head, which is incorrect, as she actually should wear her name hieroglyph. And the last cartonnage, that is also very interesting, is dating to the Greco-Roman period and is unfortunately a bit damaged. So we have Anubis standing in the middle, although it's a bit hard to see, and he again is holding this vessel. Then we have the mummy again seemingly floating in the air above the bier. So the head of the bier is here, and it has the upward curved tail. And then we have Isis and Nephthys, although they have no hieroglyphs anymore, so we cannot tell who is who. It is also quite interesting that they have raised one arm in a gesture of grief, while the other arm is going behind their back, and then we have their hands. One is here and one is here, which is also something that I have not seen, as usually they seem to have raised both arms. I have not really found a parallel to any of those pieces, but I have found that there is a little bit of a similarity between this cartonnage and W877, at least in the coloring of the background, but also in the position of Anubis. And we have one object here as well as we have one object here. And I thought that was quite interesting, although I do not believe that they are copies of each other in any way. And with that, I would like to sum my talk up, as I believe we do have the expression of the wish of the deceased to become an Osiris in this motif more than we have the actual aspect of embalming. We also have, or can see, a migration of the motif from the third intermediate period all the way to the Roman period. So at first in the New Kingdom we can see the motif migrating from the papyri to the tomb walls, and from there it migrates to coffins, to amulets, to mummy masks, and especially in the Roman period to mummy shrouds as well. And we also have a major reduction in the variations of the motif. We have seen some of them in the Swansea objects, and that means we have almost no architectural element anymore. The position of Anubis' hands is reduced to a very small set of variations compared to the 6 variations we had in the New Kingdom. And the Bier is now always represented with head and tail. So we have a complete loss in all the variations from the New Kingdom. And that also means we have some new iconographic elements that do emerge. For example, the vessel that Anubis is holding, or some of the objects that can appear underneath the Bier. And I still, as this is a work in progress, I still have to figure out maybe the times when is which iconographic element appearing or disappearing, and what might be the reasons for this. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for joining me tonight, and want to give you my last slide, that is just some sources on my slides 13 and 14.